When did your boss nearly end someone's life? I was cleaning up after my daycare snack time when I noticed 3-year-old Eloise scratching at her neck and wheezing in the corner by the blocks. I ran to the owner, Mrs. Henderson, to tell her Eloise was having an allergic reaction. Henderson barely looked and said Eloise was just being dramatic because her mother coddles her too much. She said if I kept overreacting to every child's tantrum, I wouldn't last long in childcare. 5 minutes later, Eloise was gasping like she was breathing through a straw and her eyes were swollen shut. I begged Henderson to let me call Eloise's mom, or at least check her file for allergies, but Henderson stood up and got in my face. She said if I made one phone call or disturbed one parent over a child's attention-seeking behavior, she'd not only fire me but make sure I never worked with children again by reporting me for causing unnecessary panic. That's when Eloise collapsed onto the reading mat and started making these tiny choking sounds that I'll never forget as long as I live. Her fingernails were turning blue and she was clawing at her throat like she was trying to rip it open to get air, and the other kids started screaming because they knew something was seriously wrong. I ran to the medical cabinet where we kept the EpiPens, but Henderson blocked me with her body and said I was not authorized to give any medications without written parental consent on file. I shoved past her and grabbed the pediatric EpiPen while she screamed that she was calling the police to have me arrested for assault and practicing medicine without a license. Eloise's whole face was swollen like a balloon and her lips were purple, and when I knelt beside her she wasn't even crying anymore because she didn't have enough air to make sounds. Henderson was on the phone with her lawyer screaming about liability and lawsuits while this tiny 3-year-old was dying on our classroom floor, and she kept saying Eloise was just holding her breath to manipulate us. I ripped open the EpiPen package with shaking hands while Henderson threatened to destroy my entire life if I touched that child with that needle. The other assistant was crying and begging me not to do it because Henderson would ruin both of us, but all I could see was Eloise's face turning from blue to gray. Henderson grabbed my wrist and tried to wrestle the EpiPen away from me, screaming that she'd been running this daycare for 20 years and knew a faker when she saw one. I shoved her off and she fell backward into the toy shelf, and that's when she really lost it, shrieking about assault charges and how I'd go to prison. The room smelled like urine because Eloise had wet herself, and her little chest was barely moving anymore, just these tiny shallow gasps that were getting further apart. I pulled the blue safety cap off the EpiPen, and Henderson screamed that if that child died from that injection, I'd be charged with murder, but if I put it down right now, she'd only fire me. The other kids were huddled in the corner crying, and one boy kept asking if Eloise was going to die while Henderson yelled at him to shut up and sit down. I positioned the orange tip against Eloise's thigh like I'd been trained, and Henderson was standing over me screaming that she was calling 911 to report an assault in progress by a rogue employee. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely hold the pen steady, and I kept thinking about how Eloise's mom dropped her off that morning and said she'd been so excited about show and tell today. Henderson was filming me with her phone saying she needed evidence for the police and her insurance company, and she kept repeating that when this was over, I'd never work anywhere again. I looked at Eloise's face one more time and her eyes had rolled back and she wasn't moving at all, just this horrible rattling sound coming from her throat. I pressed the EpiPen against her thigh and pushed until I heard the click, holding it there while counting to 10 like the training said, and Henderson let out this scream like I'd stabbed her instead of Eloise. She was calling me a criminal and a child abuser and saying I'd just killed this child with my paranoia and incompetence, that Eloise was allergic to the medication and I'd sent her into cardiac arrest. The medicine went in and I pulled the pen out, and Eloise just lay there completely still and gray, while Henderson stood over us ranting about prison sentences and medical battery and how she had it all on video. I put my fingers on Eloise's neck trying to feel a pulse, but my hands were shaking too much and her skin felt cold and wrong, and all I could think was what if Henderson was right and I just killed this baby with my need to play hero. I moved my fingers down to the softer spot under her jaw and pressed harder, and then I felt it, this tiny flutter against my fingertips that was barely there but definitely real. Eloise made this small gasping noise that wasn't like the choking from before. It was more like she was trying to pull in air and actually getting some. Her chest moved up a little bit more than it had been, and the awful gray color on her lips started looking less like death and more like just really pale skin. I grabbed my phone from my pocket with my other hand and dialed 911, my fingers slipping on the screen because they were so sweaty, and when the operator answered, I told her we had a 3-year-old girl who just went into anaphylactic shock and I'd given her epinephrine about 30 seconds ago. Henderson screamed that I was making everything worse by calling them and creating a panic when the child was fine, and she kept her phone pointed at me recording every single thing I did. The other assistant was still pressed against the wall crying with her hands over her mouth while all the kids were huddled in the corner watching everything happen, and I yelled at her to get them out of here right now. She just stood there frozen for a second like she couldn't understand what I was saying, then finally started moving toward the kids with her hands shaking so bad she could barely grab the door handle. Eloise's eyelids started fluttering like she was trying to open them, and she let out this thin, weak cry that didn't sound like any noise a normal 3-year-old would make, but at least it was sound coming from her throat. Her skin was changing from that horrible gray to more of a pale pink color, and I could see her chest moving up and down in a rhythm that was getting stronger and more regular instead of those tiny gasps from before. Henderson got right in my face with her phone still recording and said this was all for show, that Eloise was fine and always had been fine, and I needed to hand over the used EpiPen immediately so she could dispose of it properly. I clutched it tighter because the training videos said to save it for the paramedics so they'd know exactly what was given, and I told her to back off and let me help this kid. I looked at my phone screen to check the time and it said 2:47 p.m. and I said it out loud so I wouldn't forget when I'd given the injection because the paramedics would need to know. My hands were still shaking, but I kept thinking about the medical protocol we'd learned in training and how it was the only thing keeping me from completely losing it right now. The sirens were getting louder, and Henderson told me I needed to leave the premises immediately because I was fired and now trespassing on her property. I told her I wasn't moving until the paramedics got here to take Eloise and she could call the cops if she wanted, but I wasn't leaving this little girl. The other assistant finally managed to get all the kids into the hallway, and I could hear her trying to sing some song to calm them down even though her voice kept breaking. I stayed right next to Eloise watching every single breath she took and hoping the medicine would keep working until help got here. Henderson started walking around the room talking out loud about how a rogue employee had attacked a child against direct orders, and she had the whole thing on video for evidence. She kept saying things like how she'd tried to stop me but I'd assaulted her and given unauthorized medication to a child who was just having a tantrum, and I realized she was practicing her story for when the police and lawyers showed up. My stomach dropped because I knew how bad this this could look with her being the owner, and me being just some employee who'd been there 6 months. Eloise started crying for real now. Not loud or strong, but this steady whimpering that actually sounded more like a normal kid, and her breathing wasn't making that drowning sound anymore. She was still really swollen, and her face looked wrong, and she definitely needed to get to a hospital fast, but she was alive and getting better, and that was the only thing that mattered to me right now. The front door slammed open so hard it bounced off the wall, and 2 paramedics rushed in with their big red bags and a stretcher on wheels. The guy in front dropped to his knees next to Eloise and immediately put an oxygen mask over her face, while his partner started pulling out tubes and needles and monitors. He checked her pulse and breathing and started hooking up these sticky pads to her chest that connected to a machine that started beeping, and his partner was already getting an IV ready and asking me when this started and what happened. I handed him the used EpiPen with the orange tip still out and told him I gave it at exactly 2:47 p.m. because I'd looked at the clock right before, and I explained how Eloise had been wheezing and scratching her neck, and then her face swelled up and she turned blue. He nodded and said I did exactly the right thing, that with anaphylaxis, every minute counts, and the EpiPen probably saved her life. Henderson tried to push between us and started telling them how I'd overreacted and given medication without permission, but the paramedic's partner just asked her to please step back so they could work. I wonder what Henderson's real deal is here, refusing to help a child who's clearly dying right in front of her. There's something deeply wrong when someone cares more about lawsuits than a 3-year-old turning blue, and I'm curious what made her so scared of liability that she'd risk a kid's life. She started screaming about lawsuits and how they needed to know I wasn't authorized to give any medications, but they just kept working on Eloise and checking her vitals and adjusting the oxygen. The first paramedic asked who gave the epinephrine, and I said it was me, and I was ready for him to tell me I'd done something wrong or made things worse. Instead, he just nodded again and said the timing was good, and Eloise was responding well to treatment, that her oxygen levels were coming up and her airways were opening. Henderson grabbed her phone and dialed 911 right there in front of everyone, yelling that she needed police immediately for an assault at her daycare. She told them an employee had injected a child with drugs without permission, and that I was dangerous and unstable and needed to be arrested before I hurt someone else. My whole body went cold listening to her describe me like I was some kind of criminal when all I'd done was save a little girl's life. The paramedic asked about Eloise's allergy action plan and emergency medical forms, so I pointed to the filing cabinet where we kept all the kids' paperwork. I pulled out Eloise's folder, but when I opened it, there was almost nothing inside. Just a basic enrollment form with her mom's name and phone number, but no allergy list, no medical history, no emergency contacts besides her mom, nothing that should have been there for a child with severe allergies. The paramedic looked at the empty folder and then at Henderson, who was still on the phone with 911 making me sound like a monster. The door flew open again, and Eloise's mom ran in sobbing and trying to get to her daughter, but Henderson hung up and intercepted her before she could reach us. She started telling Eloise's mom how I'd overreacted to normal toddler behavior and given her daughter unnecessary medication that could have killed her, but Eloise's mom pushed past her and dropped down next to Eloise, touching her face and crying and asking the paramedics if she was going to be okay. They told her Eloise was stable but needed to get to the hospital right away, and they started loading her onto the stretcher. The mom climbed into the ambulance with them, and right before they closed the doors, the paramedic told her the epinephrine I gave probably saved critical time. She looked back at me with this expression I couldn't read, like she didn't know whether to thank me or blame me, and then the doors shut and they drove away with the sirens going. 2 police officers walked in about 5 minutes later, and the first one introduced himself as Officer Joel Verma and said they'd gotten a call about an assault. Henderson immediately started waving her phone around and demanding they arrest me for assault and practicing medicine without a license, saying she had the whole thing on video. Joel separated us and had Henderson go first while I waited in the other room with the other officer. I could hear her through the wall telling him how I'd attacked her and given illegal drugs to a child, how I'd ignored her direct orders and committed medical battery. After about 10 minutes, Joel came and got me and asked for my version while his partner went to look at Henderson's phone. I told him everything that happened, how Eloise couldn't breathe and was turning blue and Henderson wouldn't let me help or call anyone. Joel asked to see the video on Henderson's phone, and I watched his face change as he watched Eloise on the screen turning purple and choking, while Henderson stood there doing nothing. He asked Henderson why she didn't call 911 herself when the child was clearly in medical distress, and she started stammering about liability concerns and insurance issues and how she'd been in childcare for 20 years and knew when kids were faking. Joel's face got harder as he watched, and when the video ended, he looked at Henderson like she was something stuck to his shoe. Henderson's hands were shaking as she tried to grab her phone back, but Joel held onto it and told her this was evidence now. That's when Henderson turned to me and her whole face went red, and she pointed at the door. "You're fired," she said, and her voice was so cold it made my stomach drop. "Give me your keys right now and get out of my daycare." My hands were shaking, so bad I could barely get the keys off my keychain, and when I handed them over, she grabbed them and said she'd make sure I never worked with kids again anywhere in the state. Joel started to say something, but Henderson cut him off and said she had every right to fire an employee who assaulted her and gave unauthorized medication. My legs felt like jelly as I walked to get my purse from the break room, and I could hear Henderson on the phone with someone saying she needed them to change all the locks immediately. The other assistant wouldn't even look at me when I walked past her, and the parents who were still there just stared at me like I was some kind of criminal. I got in my car, and my hands were gripping the steering wheel so tight they hurt, but I couldn't make myself let go. The drive home was completely silent because I couldn't even turn on the radio without my hands shaking too much. Every time I blinked, I saw Eloise's purple lips and heard that awful rattling sound from her throat, and I had to pull over twice because I couldn't see through the tears. When I finally got home, I just sat in my car in the driveway for 20 minutes because I didn't know what else to do. That evening around 7, my phone rang from a number I didn't recognize, and when I answered, a man's voice said he was Henderson's lawyer. He started listing all the charges they could file against me, including assault, battery, practicing medicine without a license, and endangering a child. I tried to tell him I saved Eloise's life, but he just talked over me and said if I contacted any parents or spoke to anyone about what happened, they'd sue me for defamation and make sure I went to prison. My voice was shaking when I asked if he knew Eloise almost died, and he said that was Henderson's point, that I'd overreacted to a child holding her breath and could have killed her with that injection. He said they had video proof of me assaulting Henderson and giving unauthorized medication, and no jury would side with someone who attacked their employer. After he hung up, I couldn't stop shaking, and I knew I needed to write down everything that happened before I forgot any details. I opened my laptop and started typing everything from the moment I saw Eloise scratching her neck to when the paramedics took her her away. My fingers kept hitting the wrong keys because my hands wouldn't stop shaking, but I kept typing anyway. I wrote down the exact time I noticed Eloise wheezing, what Henderson said when I told her, how long it took for Eloise to start turning blue, everything Henderson said about liability and lawsuits. The laptop screen kept blurring through my tears, but I forced myself to keep going because I knew this might be the only proof I had of what really happened. By the time I looked at the clock, it was after 3 in the morning, and I had 15 pages of notes with every single detail I could remember. I saved it in 3 different places and emailed a copy to my personal email just to be safe. The next morning, I texted the other assistant asking if she'd be willing to tell someone what really happened with Eloise. She texted back within 5 minutes saying she was sorry, but she couldn't afford to lose her job, and Henderson had already threatened to fire anyone who talked to me. She asked me not to contact her again, and said she had kids to feed and couldn't risk it. I stared at her message for a long time because we'd worked together for 2 years, and I thought she'd at least want to do the right thing. Around noon, I was scrolling through Facebook when I saw someone had tagged me in a local parents group, even though they'd removed the tag later. The post had screenshots of someone saying an employee at Henderson's daycare had stabbed a child with a needle without permission and nearly killed her. The comments were horrible, with people calling for whoever did it to be arrested and saying they'd pull their kids out immediately. My name was starting to show up in the comments even though I wasn't tagged anymore, and people were sharing my profile picture and saying I looked like someone who would hurt kids. I spent the rest of the day calling lawyers trying to find someone who would help me, and most of them wouldn't even give me a free consultation when I mentioned Henderson's name. Finally, I found Keegan Haddad, who said he'd worked on whistleblower cases before and would meet with me for free. When I told him the whole story, he said I definitely had protections for reporting child endangerment, but warned me that didn't mean Henderson couldn't make my life hell while we fought it out in court. He said these cases could take years and cost thousands of dollars I didn't have. The next morning, Joel Verma called and said he needed me to come to the station to give a formal statement about what happened. He sounded tired but told me not to discuss anything on social media while the investigation was ongoing, and that included defending myself in those parent groups. He couldn't make any promises about how the investigation would go, but said they were taking it seriously. That evening, I went online and filed a complaint with the State Child Care Licensing Board about Henderson's daycare not having allergy plans posted and her refusing to help a child in medical distress. The form took forever to fill out, and I had to attach all my notes as evidence. The automated response gave me a case number and said someone would contact me within 5 business days, which seemed like forever when kids were still going to that daycare. The next morning, my phone rang early, and it was someone named Hector Volkov from the licensing board saying he needed to schedule an interview about my complaint. The lawyer calling to threaten imprisonment while claiming she overreacted to a child holding her breath. That's quite a story they're spinning when Henderson's own video shows a child turning purple. Something tells me this lawyer hasn't actually watched that footage himself yet. He sounded exhausted and mentioned they'd received multiple complaints about Henderson's daycare recently, which made me wonder what else had been happening there that I didn't know about. My phone buzzed while I was still on the call with Hector, and I saw a text from Eloise's mom saying Eloise was stable in the pediatric unit. The message was short and didn't say thank you, but it didn't blame me either. I sat on my couch and cried harder than I had in years because at least she was going to be okay. The next morning, a thick envelope arrived by certified mail, and my hands shook as I signed for it. Inside was a demand letter from Henderson's lawyer with all this legal language about how I'd violated company policies and committed assault. The letter demanded I sign an NDA agreeing never to discuss what happened in exchange for them not pressing criminal charges against me. My head was spinning trying to understand all the legal terms, so I took photos of every page and emailed them to Keegan immediately. He called back within an hour and told me not to sign anything and to save every document I received. 3 days later, Hector called to tell me he'd inspected the daycare that morning and found expired EpiPens in the medical cabinet. He said 5 children had known allergies according to parent interviews, but there were no emergency plans on file for any of them. The staff training records showed nothing for the past 2 years, even though state law required annual training. He warned me that Henderson had connections in the licensing board who might protect her, but said what he found was serious enough for immediate action. That same night around 11, my phone lit up with texts from the other assistant at the daycare. She said Henderson was telling everyone to say Eloise had just been holding her breath for attention and making them practice their stories. The assistant was scared because Henderson threatened to blacklist anyone who didn't back her up, but she felt guilty about lying. I could tell from her messages that she was cracking under the pressure and might tell the truth if someone official asked her. I stayed up the entire night organizing everything I had into a clear timeline on my laptop. I arranged the screenshots of the Facebook posts where parents complained about Henderson ignoring allergies. I uploaded the photos I'd taken of the medical cabinet before I left showing the expired dates on the EpiPens. I typed out my written account of everything that happened minute by minute. Creating order from all this chaos helped me feel less powerless, even though my eyes burned from staring at the screen. The next week, Keegan picked me up and drove me to the police station where Officer Joel Verma was waiting to take my formal statement. Keegan sat beside me in the small interview room that smelled like old coffee and cleaning products. My voice stayed steady as I described everything that happened from when I first saw Eloise wheezing to when the paramedics took her away. Keegan made sure I emphasized my childcare training and certification in pediatric first aid. He had me explain in detail how Eloise's symptoms showed immediate threat to her life. Joel wrote everything down and asked follow-up questions about Henderson's exact words and actions. 2 days after that, Hector interviewed me at a coffee shop downtown about the daycare's daily practices. He seemed frustrated when I described how the medical files were mostly empty, even for kids I knew had allergies. He told me Henderson had been cited before for minor violations like incomplete paperwork, but always fixed things just enough to stay open. He asked about staff meetings and training, and I had to tell him we never had any in the 6 months I worked there. He shook his head and wrote notes about how Henderson would tell parents one thing, but do something completely different behind closed doors. A week later, Eloise's mom asked to meet me for coffee at a place near the hospital. She brought a folder with Eloise's medical records from their previous preschool showing documented allergies to peanuts and tree nuts. The records were dated 2 years ago with clear instructions for emergency treatment, including EpiPen use. She told me Henderson knew about the allergies because she'd given her copies when Eloise enrolled 3 months ago, but Henderson never put them in Eloise's file and told her the daycare was completely nut-free, so there was no need for concern. Eloise's mom showed me the enrollment forms where she'd written the allergies in 3 different places. Her hands shook as she pointed to each spot where she'd tried to make sure everyone would know. She asked if I would testify if they decided to sue the daycare for negligence and endangerment. I could see she was torn between being grateful I saved Eloise and angry that it happened at all. I told her yes, but said I needed to check with Keegan first about any risks to me. When I met with Keegan the next day, he explained that whistleblower protections had limits in private childcare settings. He said Henderson could still make it very hard for me to find work in any daycare or preschool in the area. We spent 2 hours developing a strategy where I would document everything, but only communicate through him going forward. He told me to keep copies of everything in multiple places, and to write down any contact from Henderson or her lawyer immediately. 2 days later, Hector called and asked me to come to his office because he had something to show me. I drove over there with my stomach in knots, thinking maybe Henderson had filed more charges or something. When I got there, Hector had his laptop open on his desk and turned it toward me. It was Henderson's video from that day, the one she took while Eloise was dying on the floor. The timestamp showed it was 3 minutes and 40 seconds long. Hector hit play, and I watched myself on the screen kneeling next to Eloise, whose face was swollen like a balloon. You could see her lips were purple even on the grainy phone camera. Henderson's voice was screaming about lawsuits and assault, but the camera stayed focused on Eloise, who was clearly not breathing right. Her little chest was barely moving, and her fingers were clawing at her throat. Hector paused it and pointed at the screen where you could see Eloise's fingernails were blue. He said the police gave him a copy as part of discovery, and Henderson's own video proved Eloise was in severe anaphylactic shock. He seemed disgusted that Henderson stood there filming instead of calling 911 or helping. The video kept going and showed me pushing the EpiPen into Eloise's thigh, while Henderson screamed that I was killing her. Hector said any jury who saw this would understand why I acted. That afternoon, Joel Verma called while I was at the grocery store. He said he'd spoken with the district attorney's office about the battery charge Henderson wanted them to file. The DA reviewed the case and probably wouldn't pursue felony charges since a child's life was at stake, but technically misdemeanor battery was still possible because I did push Henderson when she tried to stop me. Joel said they weren't likely to actually prosecute given the circumstances, but the case wasn't officially closed yet. He told me not to worry too much, but also not to have any contact with Henderson or go near the daycare. I hung up feeling both relieved and frustrated that this was still hanging over me. A week later, I got a thick envelope from the state licensing board. Inside was a preliminary report about their investigation of the daycare. They found 17 different violations, including no updated allergy lists, expired medications in the first aid kit, and no proper emergency protocols posted. The daycare was being put on a corrective action plan, requiring Henderson to fix everything within 60 days. At the bottom, it said she had to pay $8,000 in fines. I called Hector right away, and he said this was good for my case, but warned me Henderson wouldn't get shut down. The board rarely closed daycares on first violations unless a child actually died. He said Henderson would probably just pay the fines and keep operating. 3 weeks after that, I was eating breakfast when someone knocked on my door. A process server handed me papers and left without saying anything. Henderson had filed for a restraining order claiming I was harassing her by filing false complaints with multiple agencies. The paperwork said I'd caused her emotional distress and damaged her business reputation. She wanted the court to order me to stop all contact with licensing boards, parents, and anyone connected to the daycare. The hearing was set for next week. I called Keegan immediately, and he said this was ridiculous, but I'd still need representation. He could handle it, but would need a $1,500 retainer, which I didn't have. I had to borrow money from my parents, which made me feel like a failure at 26 years old. The restraining order hearing was in a small courtroom downtown. Henderson showed up with her lawyer and kept glaring at me across the aisle. Keegan argued that I'd only made truthful reports to appropriate agencies about a serious safety incident. The judge listened to both sides for about 20 minutes, then denied Henderson's request. She said both parties should avoid contact, but that reporting safety concerns wasn't harassment. Henderson had to pay court costs, but she smirked at me like she'd won something anyway. I still had to pay Keegan's full fee, which wiped out my savings. Over the next few weeks, I started hearing from parents I knew at the daycare. They were quietly pulling their kids out, and enrollment had dropped by half. One mom told me Henderson posted on Facebook about her commitment to child safety and how a disgruntled former employee was spreading lies to damage her business. She didn't name me, but everyone knew who she meant. Why does Henderson film a dying child for almost 4 minutes instead of helping? That choice tells me everything about her priorities. Protecting herself over saving a life. Strange how she threatens staff to lie, but keeps video evidence that proves she was wrong. Parents were choosing sides, and most didn't want the drama. Henderson kept the daycare open, but had to combine classrooms because she didn't have enough kids to justify full staff. I needed a job desperately, so I started applying everywhere. I sent applications to 15 different childcare centers in the area. Every single one rejected me after checking references. I knew Henderson was probably bad-mouthing me, but couldn't prove it. One director called me privately and said she knew I did the right thing with Eloise, but couldn't risk hiring me. She said Henderson had connections everywhere, and bringing me on would cause too much drama for her center. I was basically blacklisted from working in childcare in our area. Out of nowhere, Eloise's mom called and asked if I could babysit sometimes. She said Eloise kept asking about me and missed having me around. I said yes, even though it felt weird going to their house. The first time I babysat, Eloise ran up and hugged my legs so tight I almost cried. Watching her play normally and breathe easily made me happy and sad at the same time. Her mom always overpaid me, giving me $60 for 3 hours when the going rate was maybe $30. I knew she felt bad about my situation, but I needed the money too much to refuse. After a few weeks, I started noticing problems I hadn't expected. When I heard sirens anywhere, my heart would race and my hands would shake. At the pharmacy, I saw EpiPens in the medical aisle and had to leave because I couldn't breathe. I was having panic attacks but didn't realize it at first. I found a therapist who worked on a sliding scale based on income. In our first session, I told her about that day and couldn't stop my hands from shaking the whole time. She said I might have PTSD from the trauma of almost watching a child die while being threatened. We started working through it, but it was slow and painful. About 2 months after everything started, Keegan called with news. Henderson's lawyer had reached out with an offer. They would drop everything and not pursue any civil action if I signed an NDA. The agreement would prohibit me from ever discussing the incident publicly or privately. I couldn't talk to parents, post online, or even tell future employers what really happened. In exchange, Henderson would stop fighting the unemployment claim and wouldn't sue me. Keegan said it was a decent offer legally, but understood if I didn't want to take it. I thought about Eloise turning blue on that floor and all the other kids still at that daycare. Staying silent felt like betraying every child who might be at risk. I told Keegan to refuse the offer because some things mattered more than legal protection. 2 weeks later, a woman from Child Welfare Services called to schedule an interview about the incident. She came to my apartment with a thick folder and asked me the same questions 3 different times while typing on her laptop. She wanted to know if I'd ever seen signs of neglect with Eloise before that that day, and I told her no, the problem was with Henderson, not the parents. She kept asking about Eloise's home life, and I kept explaining that the parents had done everything right. They'd given the daycare all the allergy information, and Henderson just ignored it. The woman nodded and typed and said they had to investigate all angles when a child almost died. She left after 2 hours, and I thought that was the end of it. But then another person from a different department called the next week asking the exact same questions. This guy said he was from licensing and needed my statement about the daycare's practices. I told him everything again, and he said someone from his office would be in touch. Nobody called for 3 weeks, and then suddenly I got 4 different letters from 4 different agencies, all asking for written statements about the same incident. I spent a whole weekend writing out what happened over and over, each time for a different form, with slightly different questions. 4 months after everything happened, I finally got the letter about testifying at the administrative hearing for the daycare's license. The hearing was in a government building downtown, with flickering lights and broken elevators. Henderson was there with 2 lawyers, and she stared at me the whole time I walked to the witness chair. The panel had 5 people who looked bored before I even started talking. They asked me about the EpiPen, and I explained how I'd administered it according to our training. They wanted to know about documentation, and I told them about the allergy forms the parents had filled out that Henderson kept in her office. One panel member asked why those forms weren't in the classroom, and I said Henderson controlled all the paperwork. They asked more questions about our emergency protocols, and I described how Henderson had blocked me from calling 911 or the parents. The lawyers kept objecting to things, but the panel let me finish my story. After 3 hours, they said they'd make a decision within 30 days. 6 weeks later, the decision came in the mail. The daycare could stay open, but with conditions that barely seemed like punishment. They got a probationary license for 2 years. The staff had to do 40 hours of retraining. Inspectors would come monthly instead of yearly, and there was a $10,000 fine. Henderson still owned the place and could still take care of kids. I threw the letter in the trash and tried not to think about all the children still going there every day. Eloise's family's lawyer called me the next week to schedule my deposition for their civil case. The deposition happened in a conference room with a court reporter typing every word I said. I went through the whole story again while Henderson's lawyers took notes and asked me to repeat parts. They wanted exact times and exact words, and I did my best to remember everything clearly. The lawyer asked if I was angry at Henderson, and I said no. I was just sad that she'd almost let a child die. After 4 hours of questions, they finally let me leave. The police called a month later to say they were closing their investigation. The detective said there wasn't enough for criminal charges against anyone, not Henderson for endangerment and not me for assault. He said the incident report would be public record though, so anyone could request it and see what really happened. I asked if that meant Henderson faced no consequences, and he said that was for the civil courts to decide. 6 months after everything, I finally found a new job at a community center teaching art to kids after school. The pay was $12 an hour instead of $15, and I didn't get health insurance, but at least I wasn't making medical decisions. The kids painted and made collages, and nobody's life was in my hands. I could sleep without nightmares about blue lips and purple fingernails. My savings account was empty from Keegan's legal fees, and I was eating ramen most nights, but it felt worth it to be away from that world. Then one Tuesday, my phone buzzed with a text from a number I didn't recognize. It was a photo of Eloise on a playground with chocolate ice cream all over her face and a huge smile. The message just said she's doing great, thank you. No long conversation or promises to stay in touch, just proof that she was alive and happy. I saved the photo and looked at it sometimes when my hands started shaking. They still shake when I hear certain sounds like wheezing or gasping or when someone mentions allergic reactions. Sometimes I wake up at 3 in the morning with my heart racing, remembering the weight of that EpiPen in my hand and Henderson screaming about prison. But when I think about that moment, about choosing between my job and Eloise's life, I know I'd make the same choice every single time. Thanks for hanging out and questioning things with me today. I had a lot of fun sharing these thoughts with you all. Until next time, take care. And if you made it to the end, drop a comment. I love reading all your comments.